killing it. She's going, oh man, he called me out. He said something to me. Dadgummit. By the way, that was online. Everybody heard that, Amanda. So, good morning once again. It is always good to be able to stand up here in front of you and to open God's Word and to have the privilege of explaining it and trying to present it in a way that impacts your life and helps you in understanding the importance of how to live and how to honor and glorify the name of Christ, which as Christians, called by His name, purchased by His blood, we have a responsibility to be a witness, to be ambassadors, to tell the world about Him. Amen? And in that, we always think about going and knocking on doors or sitting by somebody in an airplane and witnessing. And we think of that as some sort of external activity that we engage in. And yet what I want to talk to you today about on this Mother's Day is the internal responsibility and influence that you as a mom, and really all of us, can have on those that God entrusts to us as stewards. You see, our children are our stewardship. We have been given the great privilege of raising them, of preparing them for life. And I'm not going back, and I don't want you to think about who influenced your life, although you can. I mean, I was very blessed. My mother was a fantastic example to me. Today's sermon is Where You Go, I Go, the power of example, and it fits very neatly within the preaching theme that I talked about in January about leaving a legacy and building a future, how you as parents have the opportunity to invest in your children or in the lives of those around you, and you can make a difference just by the example of your life. We're going to look at that with really two people in the book of Ruth. We're going to primarily look at Naomi, and we're going to secondarily kind of look at Ruth and how she saw Naomi, her mother-in-law, in this passage. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 1, starting with verse 1, and we're going to read through the whole chapter when we get there. But a little bit of background. A lot of people see that or think that Ruth was simply a single-themed letter, that it was simply about the preservation of the royal line of Jesus. And y'all know that Ruth is in that line of Jesus. You can go to Matthew chapter 1, and you can see where she is listed as one of those that are in the line of Christ, direct line of Christ, direct line to David. She eventually will marry Boaz. I hope that's not a spoiler alert for anybody that hadn't read the book of Ruth. But she is eventually going to marry Boaz, or Boaz is going to marry her, however you want to look at it. I thought I married my wife. I think she got me to marry her. I'm not sure how it works, but I know that I had to be with her for the rest of my life. And she was the one that I wanted to be with. So, we see that, and we see the preservation of the line of Christ in that. And actually, Boaz's mother was Rahab the harlot from Jericho. And when you go and you start reading that genealogy about Jesus' line, all of a sudden you realize everybody's represented there. And he was not just, but he is for all. And that's another sermon for a different day. Let me get back on topic right now. But within this book, there's a lot of different themes. You can read this book, and the idea of the kinsman redeemer comes up. So we see Boaz redeeming Ruth and the family line that she lost when her husband died, and how through his redemption, that family line continued. And that's a reflection of what Christ did for us. You see in this book a story of hope, also of heartache. You see in this book a true representation as Naomi just basically bears her heart over the difficulties that she's faced. And you see Ruth with those wonderful lines, where you go, I will go, and where you live, I will live, and your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. And we hear wonderful sermons over that. But I want to talk to us about the power of example. And that example was set by Naomi, and how she lived her life. She is the one that because of her life, her faithfulness to Yahweh, she takes a Moabite woman, Ruth, who comes into their home and lives for 10 years. And through the example that Naomi sets, all of a sudden Ruth goes, man, this God is worth following. This God that you serve is worth living for. And even when her fortunes are turned with the loss of her husband, she says, I don't want to go back to my family. I want to stay with you, Naomi. I want to stay with you, and I want to go and serve your God, because I have seen your faithfulness even in the midst of difficulties and hard times. And to put it back to us, that is the power that we have when we live a life of faith. That even in difficult times, how we respond is a testimony to those that are around us. And how we live out our faith each and every day, even with all the difficulties that arise and the obstacles that are before us and the heartaches that we endure. When we live out a life for faith, a life of faith, it becomes a witness to a lost world. And the lives of those people around you are changed forever. And we get to specifically moms, and I'm going to include tangentially the dads, because we have some part in this whole thing. But when we live out a life of faith in our homes, and our children see what is important in our lives, and we are consistent in our walk, and we are open with them when difficulties arise, and how we get through those difficulties by putting our trust in Christ and trusting that He is going to provide. And we have a faith that is evident in every action that we take. It becomes a witness to our children. It becomes the hope that they find as they find Christ through your actions, through your witness, through your lives. And grandparents, you're not left out of this either. You still have great influence. You still have an opportunity to pour into the lives of your family and to live in a manner that affects them as you go through the difficulties of life. And by the way, I just learned this last week, this whole growing old thing is not for the faint-hearted. You go out and you do some work on things that was not a problem 20 years ago, and all of a sudden you're hurting in ways you never thought you could hurt. But some of y'all know that better than me, so I'm just going to leave it there and not touch it. But that this book is named after Ruth is amazing, because she's a Moabitess. They were the enemies of Israel. And here's Israel taking this book, putting it into the Old Testament canon, and reading it with reverence. But still, the odd thing is, the book is really more about Naomi than it is about Ruth, and how she lived a life that set an example for Ruth. The book opens with a famine in the land. The book opens with difficulties in the nation of Israel. It's in the time of the judges. It's set out there, and they need to leave the land, or at least they leave the land in hopes of finding a better place over in Moab. And yet you'll see that was really not what was intended, and yet God turned that for good. as we go through this first 22 verses of chapter 1. If you would, normally we stand in honor of reading God's Word. I'm going to let you sit. It's 22 verses, and it's a narrative, and it's long. But we stand in honor of God's Word because we recognize that it is authoritative, that it is God's revelation of Himself to us. And so if you promise not to take it for granted as I read it, you can stay seated as I read these 22 verses and we get into the book of Ruth, okay? Listen as I read. We're going to be reading from the Holman Christian Standard. It's an eye chart up there, but you can read it pretty good. Starts out like this. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, and a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to live in the land of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they entered the land of Moab, and they settled there. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives, and one was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. As they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 children and without her husband. Since she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to leave the land of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to His people's need by providing them food, she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. She said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show faithful love to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord enable each of you to find security in the house of your new husband." She kissed them and then wept loudly. "No," they replied to her, "we will go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Do not persuade me to leave you or to go back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh punish me and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to persuade her. The 2 of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival. And the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has pronounced judgment on me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi came back from the land of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabitess, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. I was about to say you can be seated, but y'all are already seated. Some things are just habit. So let's look at the story real quick, and then we're going to get into the characters, all right? We're going to get into the people. Here's what's going on. This is in the time of the judges. This is in a time when there was no king in Israel. And what the people of Israel are doing, they had come out of Egypt, they had taken the land. And if you go to the first chapter in Judges, it says that when they had taken the land, Joshua and all those that were with him served the Lord all of the days of their life. But then there arose a generation that did not know of the goodness of the Lord and did not serve him. And so what you see is the further away they get away from the events of the being restored to the land and being brought back and being brought out of Egypt and all of the miracles, people began to forget. They began to forget what God had done for them, and they began to fall away from the faith. Now, if you remember, or maybe you don't, if you go back and look at Deuteronomy and you read all the way through it, it's a good book. It really is. I highly recommend it. It says in there, the Lord is talking to his people. He says, if you will keep my commands. And then he gives them a list of all these things he's going to do. He's going to bless them. Their crops are going to yield. Their families are going to be full. The women are never going to be barren. They're always going to have children. Their enemies will flee from them. I mean, he lists all of these things out in the book of Deuteronomy. And then he says, but when you do break my commands, then I will bring calamity upon you, basically. Your crops won't yield. Your enemies will cause you to flee. I mean, all of the bad things will happen. Now, God keeps his word. He's always faithful. And so what you see in the book of Judges is you begin to see the nation of Israel fall away, fall away, fall away. And there's a series of judges that God sends to try to bring them back, to bring them back, and bring them back. Ruth is most likely set in that time frame. And so Bethlehem, which ironically means house of bread, Bethlehem and that area was experiencing a famine because of the disobedience of God's people. God had brought a famine onto the land in Bethlehem, and so there was nothing to eat. There was a drought. There was no food to be had. And you see that this family hears that over in Moab, that place where our enemies reside, they've got food. And the story progresses from there that Elimelech takes his family, moves to the land of Moab, and then things begin to happen. He dies. His sons die. They take a wife first. They both take wives first. Then the sons die. And now here is Naomi, an Israelite, in a foreign land, stuck. Because this is just the way it was back then. A woman had no way of providing for herself. There was no way. She couldn't go down to the unemployment office. She couldn't go to a local place of business. She couldn't put in a resume. She couldn't find a job. The way families survived back then was you had a husband. You were part of that family. That husband provided for you because they had land. They had rights. They could do these things. But when you became a widow, you were out in the cold. I mean, you were just out in the cold unless you had a family to take care of you. And when Elimelech died, of course, Naomi had her sons and wives to take care of her. And so that's sort of the story that's going on, that's happening right there. And we could go a little bit further, and we could talk about how Boaz sees Ruth, and he takes her, and he intends to marry her, and all the story that goes through there. And it's a great book, and it's a great example of God's redeeming grace. I highly recommend you go through it, but we want to focus on this right now. And so right now, Naomi's in the land. She's a widow, and she has two daughters-in-law that are both widows with her, and they're wondering what they're going to do. And so let's look really quickly in the first 5 verses. All the characters, at least in this section, are listed. And there's something about a name. In the Old Testament, names were descriptive in many ways. Like Mephibosheth, which was a descendant of Saul, was the son of Shem. Bosheth is Shem, and Mephibosheth was son of Shem. And so it described who he was. And these names are really no different. You're going to see that as we go through it. There's something in a name. Let's look at Elimelech first. He's mentioned twice in the Bible, both right here. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, and a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his 2 wives and sons to live in the land of Moab for a while, and the man's name was Elimelech. Now, Elimelech means lover of God, or God is my king. Now, you don't get a name like God is my king without living that out, do you, right? Y'all can at least shake your head or do something. Give me some sign you're awake. I mean, you got to figure if the writer of Ruth is putting in that this guy's name was lover of God, that he had lived out and earned that reputation in some shape, form, or fashion. How many of y'all liked wrestling growing up? Didn't the wrestlers have the most descriptive names? I mean, I can't remember any of them. Like, there was Johnny Mandel, who was the Eagle, and somebody was probably named the Destroyer and all that. And they were supposed to be names that were descriptive. So Elimelech, lover of God, or king, or God is my king, is a descriptive name. But understand what he did. How could somebody who says God is my king, which means he trusted God, when there was a famine in the land, decided to take his family from the land God had given them and move them to a place that was their sworn enemies? So even though he followed God, even though he said, God is my king, I'm going to do what he tells me to do, God told him not to leave the land, and yet what did he do? He leaves the land. So a reader, a Hebrew reading this would have gone, something doesn't fit here. His name is God is my king, and yet he's leaving the land that God gave him. So right there, somebody reading this story would have said, okay, something is going on here. What Elimelech was doing is what a lot of us do today. He was walking by sight and not by faith. He saw that there was food over there, and rather than trust God to provide the food that he needed in Bethlehem, he said, all right, family, let's pack up. We're going west, young man. Let me think. Yeah, they would have gone west. We're going west. No, they would have gone east. We're going east. We're going east. Going west would have put them into the Mediterranean. We're going west. We're going east. Whatever. They're going over to Moab. And so he packs them up. He moves them that way, all in disobedience to what God would have wanted them to do. Now, God knew he was going to do this, so God is still in control. And so, we're okay. So here's God is my king, Elimelech, being disobedient and moving his family over to Moab. Nothing good happens when you're disobedient to God. Okay? Now, his two kids, they're talked about here. Their names are Mahlon and Chilion. Now, Mahlon in Hebrew means sick, and Chilion means pining or whiny. Now, I know that these names are descriptive because I can't see Elimelech and Naomi having their first baby son and going, oh, look at him, he's so wonderful. Let's name him Mahlon. Let's name him sick. And they had their second son, Chilion. Oh, look, this is Chilion. He's whiny, he's pining. So it has to be descriptive of them. And what you see is that the readers back in the day, and by the way, my job as a preacher is to contextualize so you can understand how the readers in the day would have understood this. The readers would have read that and said, okay, something is wrong with those two men. Or they wouldn't have named them sick and pining or sick and whiny. We have God is my king who is disobedient, and both his sons whose names are sick and pining or whiny. What is about to happen? Both of them married Moabite women against the command of God. Now here's where parents, our actions carry consequences to our children. Those two boys should have never been in Moab in the first place. They shouldn't have been there. But because of dad's disobedience, are you listening, dads? I know this is Mother's Day, and they said, dadgummit, we're supposed to be left alone. But dads, are you listening? Because of Elimelech's disobedience and taking them to a place that they should not have been, they were now in disobedience to what God commanded them not to do. So if you're a parent today, don't ever say, well, that's my kid. He has to choose on his own. Listen, your children, for better or worse, learn a lot of how their actions go by you. And we hope that it's for the better and not the worse. And I've known many a person that's overcome the bad example that they've had, and they've become the good example to their children. But you be the good example. Be in obedience to God. But it was forbidden for them to marry Gentile women, and Moab was an enemy. And so you know something's going to happen to them. They took 2 wives, Orpah and Ruth. Orpah means stubborn. Now, she clings to Naomi at some point, but ultimately she makes the wrong choice as she decides to go back to her home. She starts off for Bethlehem. She starts off in the right direction, but she doesn't follow through. Now, poor Orpah gets a bad rap. Everybody says, well, she should have gone with Ruth and Naomi. She should have stuck with them and all that. But Naomi tells her, hey, you need to go back to your own people. You need to go back to your family, and at least they can provide for you because I can't. And maybe you'll be able to go back and you'll be able to find a husband and you'll be able to live out your life. So Naomi's really giving her advice that sounds pretty good. And it's really selfless advice. I mean, because, Naomi's probably advanced in years at this point, and they were probably taking care of her, but she says, you need to go back. So eventually Orpah goes back. And then you see the name of Ruth. Beautiful name, isn't it? A lot of children named Ruth. Ruth means friendship. And so as a Hebrew reader reading this story, and I get to this part and I go, Ruth is going to be a positive example in this thing. She's going to be a friend. Friends are hard to come by these days, aren't they? True friends, faithful friends. And she was faithful and committed to Naomi. She saw something in Naomi and ultimately saw God through Naomi, and it made an impact on her life. So much so that she says, I'm not going to let you go, Naomi. I'm not going to let you go. And then you see the name Naomi. It means pleasant. Nice name, right? Here's Elimelech and his wife Naomi. Here's God is my king and pleasant. Our children sick and pining. Our daughters-in-law stubborn and friend and faithful. You get the picture of how things are setting up? In verse 20, she says, listen, don't call me Naomi when the ladies come out and says, can this be Naomi? Can this be pleasant? Can this be our friend that we've missed for all these years? And she says, listen, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. And your translations probably translate it bitter. A better translation of the Hebrew is broken. She says, don't call me pleasant. Call me broken. I'm broken because of all the things that have happened. Now, how many of you can identify with Naomi and something has gone on in your life and you feel broken? You feel like God has left you maybe. And yet what you see in this first chapter is Naomi's faith. Her willingness to continue to trust in God. Even though she said, I am broken by him, she did not blame him. She sees it as it may be a consequence of her husband's actions. She sees it maybe as a consequence of them leaving Bethlehem, but she does not blame God for her circumstances. And this makes a statement to Ruth. And so that's the names that the early readers would have read as they looked at this, and they would have already gotten a sense of what the story was going to be about and how it was going to flow. Okay? So let's look specifically at how Ruth looked at Naomi. And she saw her as a wife, as a mom, and as a mother-in-law. In verses 6 through 18, there's several places that we see there, and we're going to jump around as we get through it. But the first two, as a wife and as a mom, we can only we can guess. We're not quite sure if Ruth ever saw Elimelech alive, because the passage doesn't tell us that she saw that. In fact, it gives us the impression that Elimelech was already dead, and then her sons married these Moabite women. But that could be literary. And maybe she met Elimelech, and maybe she thought, God is my king, this is a good guy, Naomi's a great mother, oh, Mahlon, I love him, he's like sick. Okay. Notice how I changed that? But anyway, sorry. But we're not sure, but what we can know is this. She would have known Naomi's story. Probably as they lived with this family, and the wives would have come into the husband's family. The husband didn't go to the wife's family, but the wife came into the husband's family. In fact, the wife's family would have paid a dowry to the husband's family to say, here is my daughter, please take her. I'll pay you. I mean, that's really what it kind of was like. But, and there's no implication. We're talking about way back then. We couldn't do that today. Wouldn't be right. But, so he's sitting there, and she's known Naomi's story. And she sees that she has been faithful in following her husband, even probably when her husband made a really, really bad decision. And guys, have you ever made a really bad decision and it's made even worse because your wife said, I don't think we should do this? No, honey, we're going to do it. We're going to do this. No, honey, I don't think we should do it. No, we're going to go. And then it all falls apart. And you're already feeling bad about it falling apart. And the last thing you want to hear is your wife go, I told you so. I told you that this wasn't a good idea. I don't know that happened. I don't know how that worked. I just know that she set a really good example. And so she sees her as a good wife to her husband, Elimelech. She followed him. She did what she needed to do to keep the family fed and to keep the family clothed. And you know, the husband would go out and work the field, and they would go and bring in the crops and go and hunt. And the wives would prepare the food and prepare the clothing and do those kinds of things. And it worked. It was a division of duties. And so she saw that Naomi was a good wife to her husband. Even if she never met Elimelech, she would at least have learned what Naomi did. And maybe after Elimelech died, Naomi never said a bad word about him. Maybe all she said was good things about him, even though they shouldn't have been where they were. And Ruth also saw Naomi as a good mother. Now, how do you know that? Well, the product is in the boys that she raised. Were they good men? The name sick and pining doesn't necessarily go to character. It just kind of gets you to the idea that they're not going to be around very long. It doesn't say that they weren't nice men, that they weren't providing for their family. They were certainly going to take care of their mother, because it says there was about a span of 10 years. So Ruth would have seen the product of Naomi's upbringing with these boys, who are now men. And she would have seen how she continued to interact with her sons and how her sons continued to interact with her. Now, I was very blessed. I had a wonderful mother. I loved her dearly, and I miss her greatly. But I have to admit, there were times she would ask me to do things, and I would, oh man, I don't want to do the dishes, Mom. The big thing was making my bed. I don't want to make the bed, Mom. And yet she would continue to get me to make the bed. And it was how she responded to me that hopefully others would have seen. And that would have been my wife. And in the later years, when she lived with us for 8 years before her death, my wife was wonderful to her. And I don't know if it was because my mother was good to her or because she saw that my mother was good to me, but it engendered in my wife a desire to be wonderful to my mother. And I loved my mother, and I would do anything for her. And so Ruth would have seen Naomi as a good mother. But here's the hard one. She would have also seen Naomi as a good mother-in-law. Is that hard to believe? I don't want to know if you have a bad relationship with your in-laws. I have a great one with mine. And even though my mother-in-law is sitting in the back, I love her dearly, and I know that I'm her favorite. She hasn't said that, even though I've tried to get her to say it, but she won't say it. She says, I love all my children, but I know that I know that I know. And I'm very blessed to have a good relationship with her, but I also know that she's a good person. And Ruth would have seen that her mother-in-law was a good person. This is where the passage begins to illuminate that some for us. First, Naomi showed her appreciation. Look at verse 8. She said to each of them, to Orpah and to Ruth, after the death of their husbands, each of you go back to your mother's home, and may the Lord show faithful love to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. Understand, what Naomi was saying is, you leave me here by myself, with no means of support, no way of taking care of myself. You go ahead and leave. They're already heading back to Bethlehem. And she says to her daughters-in-law, rather than selfishly have them stay with her and take care of her all the way to Bethlehem, she says, listen, you go back to your families. You go back where there is a chance of hope. You go back where you might have a life. And she showed appreciation for him. She said, you've been great to me, and you were great to my sons. That's a good mother-in-law, and that would have made an impression upon Ruth. But you know what? If that was the only thing Ruth saw, then, and all she saw before that was a mother-in-law that was critical, a mother-in-law that was not nice to her, a mother-in-law that said, Ruth, you never do anything right, you're not good enough to my sons, all this kind of stuff, then that wouldn't have done it for her. But instead, this was just the capstone to her being a good mother-in-law and setting a good example for Ruth and for Orpah. And so Ruth saw this. She saw that Naomi showed appreciation, true appreciation for her and Orpah. She expressed good wishes to them. May the Lord, verse 9, enable each of you to find security in the house of your new husband. And then Naomi kissed them and she wept loudly. So Ruth would have seen that this mother-in-law, even in the midst of her difficulty, even though she felt like she was broken before the Lord, she says, I want you to have what's good. I want you to have the best. That's not about self. That's not self-serving. And she demonstrates selflessness in verses 10 through 13. The daughters-in-law said, no, they said to her, we will go with you to your people. But Naomi replied, daughters, go home. Why do you want to go with me? I'm not going to have any more sons. And even if I could have a husband and I could get pregnant again and I could have sons, you're not going to wait for them to grow up. See, it's a different culture back then. You're not going to wait for me. You go back, if you want to have a chance of a life, you go back to your family. And so she shows her selflessness. But there was a bond of love between them. Again, both Orpah and Ruth, in verse 14, they wept loudly because the mother-in-law said, you go back. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Even with Orpah, there was a bond of love. She loved Naomi, but she recognized, I probably need to go back. That's the worldly wisdom. Ruth said, I don't care about the worldly wisdom. I'm sticking with you. I know your character, and I know the character of the God you serve. And so Ruth saw her as a good mother-in-law. Now, Ruth also saw how Naomi handled her grief. And that's a big thing today. How do you handle your grief? Do you trust the Lord? Do you show that you're trusting Him regardless of what you're going through and the difficulties that you might have been through? Now understand, Naomi has lost her husband and lost her 2 sons. She has no prospects of being able to advance in life or to have an easy life from this point on out. She has no idea or no hopes that as the matriarch of the family, having herself being taken care of until she finally passes away and goes the ways of her those that were before her. And so she has this grief, but it didn't destroy her faith. Back in verse 6, it says she and her daughters-in-law, now her sons have just died, Elimelech is dead. She and her daughter-in-laws prepared to leave the land of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to His people's need by providing them food. See, the grief didn't destroy her faith. She had to follow her husband into Moab because she was a good wife. But now she's in Moab and she hears finally there's food back home. And the Lord's going to take care of us. And so we got to go back there. That was a demonstration of her faith. And even though she was in grief, she still trusted the Lord because she was going to go back. This is what Ruth saw. She didn't blame God for her circumstances. She said, God is providing. We need to go back there where He wanted us to be in the first place. But you know, her grief was also honest and human. And she demonstrated that for Ruth. If you look in verse 20, as she goes down there, and this is where the women of the town in Bethlehem have come out, and they're excited, and they say, is this Naomi? This is our long-lost friend. She's back. We're excited about you being here. And Naomi goes, listen, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me broken. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has broken me. He's broken me. Now, she is not blaming God, but her grief was real. Her circumstance was real. She didn't know how God was going to redeem that. She just knew that she needed to be back where God had intended her to be. And in the midst of that heartache, she just was open and honest with Ruth. Listen, I'm broken, but I made it back here. So Ruth saw that grief didn't destroy her faith, that the grief was honest and it was human. And a lot of people try to hide their grief. You know that, don't you? It's not good to hide your grief. But the grief was also real. Verse 21, I went away full. She had a husband, she had 2 children, and I came back empty. Both sons and husband gone. I went away full, and I came back empty. And so that grief was real. And Ruth saw that. But in that, Ruth also saw Naomi's faith. She saw that she trusted God even in the midst of her grief. This would not have been something that happened at the moment her husband and her children died. This would have been something that Ruth would have seen for the 10 years or so that she lived with Naomi. This would have been something that was part and parcel to how she lived her life. And so, whether she knew Elimelech or not, she knew how Naomi handled that. And then she saw how her mother-in-law lived with her children, how Ruth's mother, Naomi, lived with her children, and how she lived for those 10 years when things were ostensibly good. By the way, it's easy to have faith when things are good, isn't it? It's really hard to have faith when things go south. But she sees that her faith is real. And what she sees is that no matter what circumstance Naomi is in, her God is always superior. Yahweh is superior. Look at verses 15 and 16. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Go follow your sister-in-law, Ruth." And this is Ruth's reply, and you've heard it before. "Do not persuade me to leave you or go back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. And your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." These are not words spoken off the cuff. These are words that come from a heart that has seen a faithful woman live and knows that it's better to hang her hat with Naomi than to go back and try to let the world take care of her. Because Naomi's hat was hung on the Lord. Naomi was trusting her. And so Yahweh was superior. And then when she says, "Your God will be my God," I'm putting away all these false gods, putting away all that I grew up with. Remember, she was a Moabitess. She would have grown up under a different religious system. She would have grown up sacrificing and worshiping idols. And here is Naomi worshiping a God that has no idol, nothing that they can visibly see, but that they trust with all their heart. And so she says, "Listen, your God will be my God. I'm following him because you're following him." There's that power of example that is so prevalent in this story. And then you see that Naomi's faith endured. In verse 19, it says the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. Now, the reason I say it endured is because Naomi could have just given up at any one time. She could have said, "Listen, it's not worth it. What have I got back in Bethlehem? I got nothing." Except she had faith. She had heard that God had provided for his people, and she was going back there in hopes that God would provide for her. So they continued to travel along the road to Bethlehem. And when they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited at her arrival. And then in verse 22, it says, Naomi came back from the land of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess, and they arrived at Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest. All her actions showed that her faith had not wavered. She continued to be faithful. This was the power of example in Ruth's life. So let me talk about that, the power of example. Moms, you affect every aspect of our lives. When we can't take care of ourselves, you're there to feed us, to provide for us, to hold us, to nurture us, to sing to us, to love us. Even when, as a boy, I wasn't quite so lovable. I've got granddaughters. They're not always lovable either. Moms, you touch every aspect of our life. You have a great influence on us. And your example of faith, of trust in the Lord, of willingness to sacrifice and to care for us, leaves a lasting and indelible impression. Just as Naomi left an impression on Ruth, so you leave an impression on our lives. Moms, you demonstrate all aspects of life to us. We see you go through the difficult times. We see you go through the good times. We see how you handle crisis. We see how you handle success. The example that you set sets our character, shows us how to live, helps us to withstand the difficulties that are before us and how to rejoice in the victories that we win. And so, moms, you are important. The power of example that you set in our lives is so vital that you teach us about all aspects of life. You teach us how to share. You teach us to say thank you. My mom taught me to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir, and no, sir. She taught me to open the door for her. Many is the time, this is back when people would still go to the mall. Many is the time, now everybody just does it online. We would go to the mall, and from a little city, go into the big city and go into the mall. That was a big deal. I can still remember we would park, and my brother and I, we would head to the door, and my mother would still be sitting in the car. Come on, Mom, come on. Come open my door for me. And we'd go open the door for her. We'd get to the door of the mall, and we'd run in, and we'd want to go to the toy section. They used to still have toy sections in the mall back then. We would want to go to the toy section, and she'd still be sitting there at the door. Come here. Open the door for me. And then the worst was this. My mom had a propensity to leave her purse in the store that was the farthest end of the mall, and she would send me back for it. Mom, I don't want to go get your purse. Go get my purse and bring it back to me. But Mom, I don't want to. And so she taught me about humility. I would get that purse and I would drag it behind me. I tried to walk as manly as I possibly could. Today I can grab Sarah's purse, I can put it over my shoulder and do whatever I need to do and then hand her her purse. Doesn't faze me. All aspects of life they affect. Moms, you are a gift from God. And on this day that we recognize you, I'm grateful for every one of you. And maybe you didn't have a great mom to give you a great example, but you can be a great mom. Maybe you haven't done as well as you wanted to do, but you can ask God to help you to change. But regardless of all those things, we're grateful for you. I'm thankful that I had a mother that loved me. Thankful that I had a mother that cared for me. I'm thankful that I have a mother-in-law that is wonderful to me. And I'm thankful for each one of you. Don't forget the example that you can set that can change the life of those around you. Be it a daughter-in-law, son-in-law, a son or a daughter, whatever the case may be, you have the power of example. You can help leave a legacy and help build a future. I pray that it's one that is walking with the Lord and trusting Him and praising Him and giving Him glory. Amen? Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you as we celebrate our moms. I think all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when you took Adam and you had him see all of the animals and name all of the animals, and then at the end of that, you talked to him and you said, see, there's none like you, none corresponding to you. And then you made woman, crafted her. You formed us from the dust of the ground, but you crafted her. And you put her together. And then you woke Adam up and you showed him. And I know that he had to have been beyond excited. And from that moment forward, moms have affected our lives, have changed our lives, have helped lead us in the way we should walk and the way we should live, and have loved us and nurtured us and watched over us. And Lord, I know that there are those that did not have that experience, but we know that you're always watching over us. And so I pray on this day, this Mother's Day, 2021, that you would bless each person here, that if they're a mom, that you would bless the work of their hands, that you would help them see the power of example that they have, that you would help them to invest in the lives of those around them, that you would give them an extra measure of love to share with those that are a part of them, and that, Lord, you would let them feel your grace and your mercy in a special way as you watch over them. I pray, Father, that each mother today would feel the love and gratitude of her children, and that, Lord, I pray that for those that feel the loss of our mother, that you would bring peace to us. But, Lord, I thank you for it. I thank you for the experience that I had with mine, and I pray, Lord, that you would bless each mom here. It's in your Son Jesus' holy and precious name we pray.